Okay, I'm going to talk about in this video a little bit about Hector, uh, the brother of Helinus, the two princes of Troy, the sons of Priam, who were Priam was the king of Troy, and ultimately the last king of Troy before it was sacked. During his rule, he was killed by the son of Achilles I believe, the temple of Zeus or Athena. I think it was Athena. Ultimately, the Trojans crossed Athena, and they lost her support because I think she felt that they were not, the egos were being too egotistical. Now, see, the Hector, what happened, unfortunately, that caused Hector to be. Hector was a great man. I'll tell you that when I watched the movie Troy, I cried literally, and understand that that movie got me so emotional. I don't get that emotional. Movies don't make me cry, and ultimately I'll try not to cry if I'm gonna cry. If a movie gets my emotions, I'll try to keep it from getting them too much. But when I saw the fight between Achilles and Hector, I literally cried, and I was literally upset because I was for Achilles and I was also for Hector. And then when the two were fighting, I was for both of them. I supported both of them. And ultimately, I wished Achilles didn't kill Hector. I was like, Hector was my brother. And ultimately, he was a great man. He was my best man. I loved him the most. I still love him the most. He was like my favorite idol, or like, he was like an idol to me, a hero. And when I saw the movie, I saw it in 2004. So I didn't know any of this back then. I didn't know that my family line goes through a bunch of Moravian kings, who the Moravian kings became, well, they're a line off of what is called the line that goes to Troy. It's ultimately a mythological line that's not necessarily real, but the line is on Ancestry.com. It's actually there, which means I found the links to all of it, even though they say they're mythological and they're not real necessarily, because no one knows if Troy was even real. They do have the mythological links that suggest they're not real, but they're there, which is interesting, because why are they there? How could you find the links if they're not real? But they are there. Literally, the Hector was one of the best men representing the ego and man, the masculinity of the singularity. The problem is that the men under Hector were misbehaving with alcohol, and the alcohol caused them to be disrespectful and what the goddesses would say was disobedient towards their wives and daughters, because they were manly men who drank alcohol and were bossy, kind of in charge, and demanded to be the leaders of the family, heads of the households, the godheads. And so Hector himself was a model man. He was a model behaving ego, and he was loved by the gods. And ultimately, he had Mars and Zeus. Mars was ultimately who Hector's had the greatest amount of. Mars, the god himself, got into Hector, made him a fierce fighter. Problem is that when Hector was fighting Achilles, he didn't have Mars. Mars had not gone in him, which is ultimately ultimately a betrayal. He could, why did the god Mars abandon him at that moment? And also, I want to say that if he didn't abandon him, then ultimately it was Hector himself who let go of Mars, because he was feeling guilty for killing Patroclus. So if you look at the beginning of the movie, if Hector faced Achilles at the temple of Apollo, and I believe that Apollo's image was destroyed by Achilles. It could have been the god himself was destroyed when Achilles went and invaded the beach first. So Achilles, I believe, could have surprise attacked the temple of Apollo. In the movie, he beheaded his statue, but I believe it could have been an actual attack on the god himself, Apollo. But in the mythology, they don't talk about the fact that he removed the influence of Apollo from Troy. So even before the Greek fleet arrived, Achilles had attacked the temple of Apollo, and possibly Apollo himself. He beheaded the statue in the movie, and like I said, he could have actually beheaded the actual god, but the influence of the protection of Troy from the beaches enabled the Greek fleet to arrive, And Hector met him in the temple, Achilles, and Achilles wouldn't fight him. I believe the reason why that is because Achilles told him, "Go back to your wife. We'll fight later." And ultimately, Hector challenged him to fight him in the temple. Hector would have won. Well, there was a big chance Hector could have won against Achilles when he faced him the first time, because he was protecting the temple of Apollo inside it, and ultimately Hector's spirit had Mars and it was ready to fight. But the goddess told Achilles, "Don't fight him yet, because it's possible he could win. He's really strong with Mars." So what they wanted to do is trick him into killing Patroclus. So understand that what I was told about the mythology of the whole thing was that Achilles tricked. Well, Achilles knew, but the goddesses wanted to trick Hector into fighting Patroclus, who was the companion of Achilles, and since it was an accident because he was wearing Achilles' armor, Patroclus put on Achilles' armor. Achilles let him do it because Achilles was asking Zeus. Achilles thought he had support of Zeus, which he did, but he also told Patroclus not to go chase him to Troy, to let them run, to just scatter them and don't follow him to the gates of Troy. So the whole thing was, when Patroclus took Achilles' armor, he was told, "Don't, like, you can go scatter them at the ships." So when they run back to the gates of Troy and you scatter them at the ships, if they run, the Trojans run back to the gates of Troy, then don't pursue them to the gates of Troy. And ultimately, Patroclus put on Achilles' armor, went out to fight him, and agreed not to do it. And they didn't tell Patroclus, if you disobey the order and follow him to the gates, that you'll end up dead. Ultimately, Zeus had already thought that, because he was told, "Do not follow him to the gates of Troy. Let him go. Let him just scatter him and make him run." And so he agreed. But in his battle frenzy, he was wearing Achilles' armor, and he scared the hell out of the Greek fleet. They were terrified when they saw Patroclus coming in Achilles' armor. They thought it was Achilles himself. And ultimately, Achilles was a badass, and he didn't die in battle, and he killed everything in front of him. So the Greeks didn't want to, or the Trojans didn't want to face Achilles in battle. And it raised the Greek spirit. So the Greeks fought way harder when they were with Achilles. So Patroclus, in battle, scattered the Trojans at the Greek ships who were trying to burn the Greek ships. Then the Trojans ran to retreat because they literally saw Achilles. It was Patroclus, and Hector got tricked into fighting Achilles there. And ultimately, the goddesses did it. They knew that Patroclus would die, and ultimately Zeus knew it was possible he would die if he disobeyed the order. Don't pursue him to the gates. He did pursue him, unfortunately, because he was just battle hardened. He didn't think it was his death guaranteed, but it was Apollo who struck him down. So literally, or Zeus, in the form of Apollo, that struck Patroclus down because he disobeyed the order. He was told not to do it, but he did it anyways, and it then enabled Hector to challenge him, and Hector was told to, with Mars, to challenge him. And then Hector killed Patroclus, and when he thought it was Achilles he killed, and when he pulled his helmet off, he saw it was Patroclus, and he felt terrible. He killed the companion of Achilles, the only one that Achilles loved. He wasn't even against Achilles. Hector didn't even hate Achilles. He actually didn't have any like beef with Achilles. So he felt terrible. Like, he thought he killed Achilles, but he killed Patroclus, his companion, and only one that Patroclus cared about in the entire world was Achilles. Liked Patroclus as his brother and his companion, and he loved him dearly. So he cared about him dearly, and he cared for no one but him, which meant that Hector knew what he did was killed the only person in the world that Achilles loved. Achilles didn't have love for anyone but his buddy Patroclus. And so Achilles was destroyed when he found out that Patroclus died, because he thought that the gods were going to keep his buddy alive, and the gods promised Achilles they would if he obeyed the order and didn't chase him to the gates. But because he did, he disobeyed Zeus, and he didn't really know, but it was ultimately Apollo that told Patroclus, "Do not disobey me, do not come at the god." And but he didn't know. He was battle frenzied, and he was in a rage. He was kicking ass, and Apollo said, "Don't do it." And Patroclus didn't know he was challenging Apollo, the god. that was the fight to Hector, and ultimately that's why Hector kicked his ass and killed him, because Apollo struck Patroclus. Actually, it was Hector's sword, but it was Apollo that made the sword kill him. So Hector had the ability to kill Patroclus, and then killed him. And then, of course, now he's feeling guilty. And now Patroclus is dead, and now Hector's spirit is guilty, and the goddesses are telling Hector, "You just killed the one man that Achilles loved and his buddy. You're so wrong." And ultimately, he was listening to the goddesses yelling at him, and they were saying, "He's good. Now you did it." He was like, "Damn!" He was like, "I didn't mean to kill his friend, and didn't even have a beef with Achilles." And ultimately, he felt bad about it. It was because he felt bad about it that he wouldn't take Mars all the way, or Mars didn't come back into him. And ultimately, it was why when he faced Achilles, he got his ass kicked, because he felt guilty, and he felt guilty bad. Like I didn't mean to kill your buddy, but Achilles was mad at him now, and Achilles was like, "You killed my best friend, you're dead." And ultimately, that was why Hector didn't have it in him anymore. He lost his spirit, whatever greatness that Hector was. Well, when he faced Achilles because of Patroclus' death, he just didn't have it in him anymore. The god was not with him, and so he was killed by Achilles. Hector died. I felt terrible about that. It was like the worst idea that Hector died. When I was talking to God for real, and God was telling me about this Trojan conflict, he was explaining to me, when you watched the movie, he said, you cried when Hector, he said, do you remember that? And I'm like, yeah, I do. Because it was very strange. I cried in real life watching that movie, and I don't cry that much. It really bothered me when Hector died, and I just was like surprised how emotional I was. And, it was only a movie. I shouldn't get all emotional about it, right? But I really cried, like in real life. Like I couldn't believe that Hector died. And ultimately, God told me that was your brother. And why you really cried during the movie when you watched it was because you were remembering it. You were actually remembering the real death of your brother at one time. So supposedly, my grandfather was Helinus, which was his brother. And ultimately, somehow, the spirit in me, which is my spirit, and the grandfathers, my grandfathers are the line that goes to one of the brothers of Hector. So he would have been my grandfather's brother. Also a younger Prince of Troy. Priam had 50 sons, and my grandfathers were one of them, Helinus. And he was the high priest, the highest priest of Apollo, and he was revered. He talked to God. He talked to the god Apollo, and was closest to him, like a pope. Like there was no man closer than Hellas to Apollo himself, and he did all Apollo's work, and he loved Apollo. Like he would do anything for Apollo. He didn't want to die for him, but he would do anything for Apollo. Like he loved his god, and he would do anything for his god. He also loved Zeus, and he would do anything for Zeus. He lived to be some kind of a servant to Zeus and the god. Like it was so important to him that he had God, and that God was with him. And ultimately, I feel the same now in real life. I'm sorry for Hector's death, and I wish it didn't happen. It heavily messed me up to think about the entire conflict in Troy. What happened? It killed us all. Like our spirit, like it changed the world forever. In the next stream, I'll talk about Odysseus and the 20 years of why I think Odysseus, why he had trouble. So I'll talk about that in the next video.